Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by Omen's new wireless range of mice, keyboards, and headsets.
You know that feeling, you have a new GPU in your PC, and life is great. And one of the greatest parts of a GPU upgrade is going back in time to those titles you loved and seeing how your new GPU fares and what kind of improvements you can get. With my having an RTX 3080 now replacing an RTX 2080 Ti in my production machine, I thought it would be good fun to go back to some key ray tracing titles that I examined on the channel over the last 2 years to see what kind of upgrades this GPU brings to the table. As I view it, the RTX 2080 Ti was a great and pretty big and powerful GPU that was forward-looking. It had ray tracing, acceleration, machine learning, acceleration, mesh shaders, and so on and so forth. With ray tracing, it had the first generation hardware implementation though, and game makers were still coming to grips with the best practices for their software to utilize this ray tracing while not destroying the frame rates completely. So ray tracing was always going to be heavy, and even with the RTX 2080 Ti that required GPU concessions, and it was challenged when using it. One of the titles I remember quite well for challenging the GPU due to its ray tracing was 2019's Metro Exodus, which uses ray tracing for its global illumination in outdoor scenes and ray traced ambient occlusion for indoor scenes. After release, I spent some time in the video making optimized settings for that game, where I thought the ray tracing on high looked excellent and keeping tessellation and hairworks on while utilizing the overall high preset looked just great. Those were my optimized settings. I recommended using those balanced optimized settings in combination with Metro Exodus's then updated inclusion of DLSS 1.0. This is indeed inferior to DLSS 2.0, but it still looked higher res than its internal 1440p resolution, and it also offered some nice performance upgrades in combination with ray tracing. Still, with those optimized settings and DLSS in place, the game is just still so incredibly heavy. An RTX 2080 Ti at stock frequency on core and memory is riding along the edge of 60 FPS for a lot of scenes in this game, and the GPU utilization is often in the 80s or 90s in a lot of scenes. Some areas of the game where ray tracing becomes particularly expensive due to the environmental design could push it over the edge constantly, like on the Taiga level. This level is really the heaviest level in the game with its usage of alpha transparency and the way its level design kind of works, where ray traced GI becomes more expensive to render. Here the RTX 2080 Ti in my play back then at optimized settings was dipping below 60 FPS for a majority of this level. It would really require an overclock to bring it into more constant 60 FPS territory, but even then that would not necessarily be a guarantee, of course. Going over to the RTX 3080 in this extremely heavy level at those same optimized settings with DLSS at 4K shows some of the usual upticks in performance that we've come to expect between these two GPUs. Just sitting around in the level, I can see a 37% uptick in performance. Much better, thankfully, than that performance uptick I saw in Flight Simulator 2020, which was actually just around 24% on average in that game. Moving around in a little benchmark path I made for myself, that is where I could actually see the visual benefits at play of that 37% higher FPS. Traversing the level at these settings incurs a heavier load on the GPU than just sitting still. So the RTX 2080 Ti will actually spend a good chunk of time in the middle 50s when you just walk around this level. It's missing the VSync window, which is important, so that interrupts the ability for a smooth 60 FPS that I typically want out of a GPU's performance. The RTX 3080 of course cleans that up and has a lot of headroom to spare. So like with most GPU upgrades here, I think that headroom above 60 FPS at my optimized settings is most interesting if I invest that in settings upgrades. In this case, I push up the ray tracing to Ultra, which doubles its internal resolution, as well as pushing up the other presets in the game to Ultra, which pushes out the range on resolution, foliage, and shadows, while increasing the precision of shader effects. Here, the RTX 2080 Ti at these Ultra settings is of course overwhelmed when looking for 60 FPS. It spends most of the benchmark path here in the 50s and the middle 40s at its worst. The RTX 3080 though at these Ultra settings does not fall below 60 FPS at all actually, but also shows less of a performance uplift over the RTX 2080 Ti. It's just 30% faster on average here. Still, with this being the heaviest level in the game, that really means the RTX 3080 is well suited for both higher performance and higher settings than the RTX 2080 Ti on every other level out there in this game, which then I subsequently went through and played through, of course, at these ultra settings. I wouldn't say the game is exactly starkly different or something at ultra settings and ultra ray tracing. It still looks really great at my optimized high settings, but I was just happy to have that performance uptick and the game not teetering so often on the edge of 60 FPS. And that extra precision of the ultra settings is just icing on the cake for that GPU upgrade as I see it. So good, but not revelatory. But just for fun though, I thought I would see how exactly far I could take the RTX 3080. How far can it be pushed in comparison to the RTX 2080 Ti? First, without DLSS here at optimized high settings. Here the RTX 2080 Ti is not suited for 60 FPS of course, but should do a locked 30 FPS just fine. The RTX 3080 in comparison is actually just 10% shy here of 60 FPS on the heaviest level in the entire game, which is really quite awesome actually. I also find it interesting here that the higher the resolution is, the higher the increase in difference is between these cards. In fact, the RTX 3080 is just 5% slower at native 4K than the RTX 2080 Ti is at 4K DLSS, which is running at an internal 1440p resolution. Similar performance without reconstruction. So what about the highest extreme settings that this game offers? Using those extreme settings, native 4K and Ultra RT, I ran around my little benchmark path. The RTX 2080 Ti here is in the middle and low 20s throughout the run, while the RTX 3080 keeps its head above 30 FPS the entire time. That means the highest settings in this game at 4K could be locked to 30 FPS should someone want to. But the most interesting conclusion out of this is how the performance difference between these two cards increases as the settings, resolution, and ray count for ray tracing increases. The RTX 3080 is 50% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti at these settings at native 4K. So it seems like the higher the settings and the higher the res is, the greater the performance the RTX 3080 has over the RTX 2080 Ti. So that title looks and runs better now, but it's not exactly extremely different. So I thought I would look at Quake 2 RTX, another game that I spent a lot of time playing for DF and just on my own in my free time, as I like this game actually. Now in this game here, I was really happy with the RTX 2080 Ti's performance. Using the game's dynamic resolution scaling to achieve 60 FPS was very doable at the highest settings. The DRS in this game is a turn it on and forget it kind of option, which I really like. But unlike Metro Exodus and other RT games, this game does not have DLSS, so you can really feel and see that resolution more than average. And because this game is path traced, the resolution that you actually set has a greater effect on visuals in this game than your average game, as every bit of the image starts to congeal and look better the higher the resolution is. More rays are shot out at a higher resolution, and so more information is there for the denoiser to work with and produce its images. Edges, texture detail, shading and lighting and shadows all look better and more stable at higher resolutions. This was the upgrade I was most interested in here over the RTX 2080 Ti. So how does the RTX 3080 affect this game's image quality and image resolve? Just running the game back and forth on both machines with dynamic resolution at the highest settings targeting 60 FPS, you can see some rather large and appreciable differences in image clarity. It affects how stable the shadows and lighting are, and how detailed the game's textures look. From my friend and colleague Richard Ledbetter's tests of this game at 1440p, we know that the RTX 3080 will be around 48% faster at that resolution. Interestingly though, in a scene targeting 60 FPS here with DRS on, RTX 2080 Ti is at a resolution of 2048 by 1152, so it's a bit higher res than 1080p. In that same scene, the RTX 3080 targeting 60 FPS is 2688 by 1512. So it's a bit higher resolution than 1440p. Doing the multiplication and division here shows that the RTX 3080 actually yields a rather large 72% higher resolution in a like-for-like scenario targeting 60 FPS with DRS on. This is interesting as it points out how the scaling efficiency curve for rays shot out is skewed for the RTX 3080 in comparison to the RTX 2080 Ti. Basically, the RTX 3080's performance is less affected the higher the resolution is, and it is less affected by the more rays being shot out and shaded. So an RTX 3080 can have a disproportionately higher resolution when you equalize performance between it and the RTX 2080 Ti. Since that is the case, I thought it would be interesting to try something else out. Quake 2 for me is a game that plays okay at 60 FPS, but like any FPS game, it actually really shines at 120 FPS. The RTX 2080 Ti with the dynamic res scaler can do this, of course, but at some larger concessions to the rendering quality and precision due to the low resolution that requires. In a scene targeting 120 FPS, the resolution is 1536 by 864 on the RTX 2080 Ti. That same scene on the RTX 3080 is 1856 by 1044. Now this is only a 46% higher resolution, whereas the 60 FPS target had a 72% higher resolution. If I were to guess why this was happening, I would reference Rich's benchmarks again. Those show that the higher resolution and the greater the ray tracing count is in a game, the greater difference we see between these two GPUs. So at lower resolutions, the RTX 3080 is comparatively slower. Its strengths for enabling a high ray count and resolution are not coming to bear at a lower resolution. So this GPU really shines the higher res and the higher settings are. But still, I'm pretty happy about this near 1080p resolution at 120 FPS at the highest settings, as it puts the game then into the realm of visual playability that I'm pretty satisfied with on a fixed pixel display. And I think you can see this pretty well when you watch them playing back side by side. That nice chunk of resolution that it gains at 120 FPS helps the visual presentation out quite a bit. But watching this, I do wonder when the next Quake 2 RTX project update could maybe happen. I would really like to see DLSS support in this game, or also other cool experimental things like ray traced motion blur, which Ampere now specifically accelerates even. Speaking of path tracing like in Quake 2 RTX, I thoroughly enjoyed the Minecraft RTX beta, which is even heavier than Quake 2 RTX on the GPU. Or at least it was when I looked at it in April of this year. Back then at 4K DLSS, which defaults to performance mode or 1080p internally, the RTX 2080 Ti did offer 60 FPS when playing through my little path traced funhouse level, but would still actually drop in those scenarios when you would go underwater, where it could dip into the mid to lower 50s. This was my little tiny level though. In the custom decked out user-made levels, going underwater there, for example, could bring down the performance to even around 40 FPS, and this is at the lowest chunk distance, by the way. The game though recently released a patch, adding in a more robust denoiser and sped up the rendering while even being of a higher quality. It also now utilizes DXR 1.1 features. Performance is really nicely increased here on the RTX 2080 Ti due to this patch. In that same area on my custom level, going underwater does not at all incur a frame rate drop under 60 FPS anymore. And on that Crystal Water Palace custom level, performance underwater is improved by more than 30%, with it just being at 54 FPS or so at its worst at 4K DLSS. This is a quite amazing performance increase from one patch to another. Now with Minecraft RTX here, we are unfortunately limited in how we can test performance due to how the game uses a composited window always. It's always going to have VSync on that's triple buffered. So like for like performance needs to be measured at raw resolutions without DLSS, so VSync caps cannot get in the way. So let's start here on the custom level looking at my little bonsai garden. At 1440p, the RTX 3080 manages to be 23% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti, which is not actually all that much, curiously. But then again, this is an area that does not exactly stress the GPU a lot. Intensive areas like those underwater on a custom level do. At those same settings on the Water Palace level underwater, the RTX 3080 increases its performance lead to 27% above the RTX 2080 Ti. So much like Metro Exodus before this, the heavier the settings are and the higher they're pumped up, the greater the difference is between these GPUs. In fact, very similar scaling is evidenced when we pump the settings up as high as they go and go for native 4K. Here the rendering chunk distance is set to the highest it can be, and it's raining at night on this custom level. And the RTX 3080 runs about 43% faster here. It's enough for 4K at 30 FPS, whereas the RTX 2080 Ti cannot do that. But 30 FPS really does not interest me so much. So how should I exactly utilize this GPU advantage? With resolution like in Quake 2? Well, let's check that out. I set up a custom resolution of 5K for the 3080 and utilized DLSS. This will then upscale the game from 1440p internally. And when you compare those 4K images produced by the RTX 2080 Ti to those 5K images produced on the 3080 side by side, the upgrade is not exactly huge. Yes, there is more precision in the path tracing here, so shadows have less dither from the denoiser, and the reflections look a bit crisper, of course. And the RTX 3080 is even less taxed at 5K than the RTX 2080 Ti is at 4K. But due to DLSS reconstruction being on for both of them, the difference between resolutions produced by these GPUs is not as stark as it would otherwise be. DLSS is a great equalizer here. Rather, I find the best upgrade for more GPU performance is to utilize higher settings by upping the game's chunk distance setting. With that set at its fullest, the RTX 3080 is able to maintain a locked 60 FPS, while the RTX 2080 Ti cannot, while both are in 4K DLSS mode. In fact, the RTX 3080 here is still rather underutilized at this resolution at this highest chunk distance. That rendering distance increase is rather obvious, especially in motion when going around the world. As I see it, increasing settings like this does a lot more for this game's visuals than increasing the internal resolution does, as DLSS reconstruction kind of makes that rather unimportant. So Minecraft RTX here is similar to that which we saw in Metro Exodus, where settings can be increased and performance can be stabilized. The last game I really wanted to return to with this new GPU was Control, a real GPU killer. Back when I made my Control video, I decided that outside of RT settings, there were some nice optimizations you can make by turning down global reflections and volumetric lighting quality to medium. But on the RTX 2080 Ti, I was not willing still to budge on any of those ray tracing effects, since they just looked so darn good when they're on, all of them. Yet running every single ray tracing effect in this game, of course, in a number of scenarios, will test the mettle of that RTX 2080 Ti. At 4K DLSS in performance mode, optimized settings, and ray tracing set to high, which is every option turned on, GPU utilization when targeting 60 FPS V-synced was often very high when I played this game back then, just like Metro Exodus essentially. The game is right on the edge of being not 60 FPS at these settings and at this resolution, to the point where smaller drops will occur in encounters that are a little bit larger or a little bit more hectic. So the RTX 2080 Ti will be missing the V-sync window in such scenarios. This is of course perfect for variable refresh rate displays where you won't even really notice that the FPS is dropping, or these can be primarily cleaned up with GPU overclocks. But what are less avoidable at these settings are those scenes that are just generally heavier, like the janitor's room, which sees its FPS in the mid-50s, or the hallway of doom, as I like to call it, where the RTX 2080 Ti at these optimized settings finds itself quite short of 60 FPS in the lower 50s, with more erratic frame times as you traverse this hallway. To remedy such sustained drops, I could of course selectively turn off some of the ray tracing effects, like transparency reflections and shadows at the same time, like I've done here, to bring up the bottom line performance. But I honestly find the game just too nice looking with these effects on. So back then I lived with these performance drops with all the RT effects turned on. So how does the RTX 3080 fare in comparison? Well, here, using that hallway as the worst scenario metric, that shows me that the RTX 3080 runs around 37 to 38% faster here at those same optimized settings that I played the game through with the RTX 2080 Ti. So there's a good chunk of headroom here above 60 FPS in this heaviest area of the game. With such headroom, you're given multiple paths about how you want to improve that gameplay experience. One of them that I could do is turn up the volumetric and global reflection quality to their highest and eliminate any aliasing or graphical warble that those can cause on medium. That brings the RTX 3080 in this heaviest scene here into the middle and upper 60s. Another upgrade path would be keeping optimized settings but upping the internal DLSS resolution to balanced above 1080p, so it's around 1260p here. That brings this GPU right on the edge below 60 FPS in this heaviest scene. Personally, I prefer a perfectly locked 60 FPS experience when it is available. DLSS reconstruction is minimally different in resolve between performance and balance mode. That difference there between these two DLSS modes is not enough to make it worth the chance at dropping frames. So I decided to play the game at just max settings at the same resolution setup of DLSS in performance mode. And going back into those combat areas where I saw the RTX 2080 Ti's frame rate buckle, I saw a completely flat line on the RTX 3080, which makes sense of course because it has a good deal of performance headroom above the 60 FPS VSync here. Even on higher settings, the GPU is just underutilized in comparison. Going into that room with the janitor, that's perfect 60 FPS with the GPU utilization in the upper 70s. That hallway of doom, it's perfect of course. It's just a generally amazing locked 60 FPS experience here with that nice DLSS image quality that I've looked at before. Generally a nice upgrade over that more wobbly performance and slightly lower settings that I had back on release with the RTX 2080 Ti. All in all, going back through this catalog of my favorite games with ray tracing, I'm generally pretty happy with the results of this GPU upgrade. All those expected things: higher resolution, higher settings, more stable performance. Going back to Control, Minecraft, and even a bit of Metro Exodus gave me a different perspective on how these GPUs scale in comparison to one another due to DLSS. With that new GPU headroom, I could have invested the upgrade in resolution, but honestly, that small bump in internal resolution of DLSS is not exactly amazing or really even visible. As I see it, DLSS is a big equalizer between these GPUs and all RTX GPUs actually. Is it really that big of a deal if your internal resolution is slightly lower on one RTX GPU versus that on another? If a game does not offer meaningful higher graphical options like other optional ray tracing features, then the main differentiator between the two GPUs with DLSS either becomes resolution or performance. Yet DLSS's efficiency at various internal resolutions nivelates performance differences to a high degree. So in lieu of other higher end graphical settings that the RTX 3080 could take advantage of, the RTX 2080 Ti is not exactly blown out of the water here. Rather, its fewer faults at my optimized settings have been cleaned up, and made a little bit prettier at the same time. A number of moments while producing this video did make me wonder though what exactly that future will be like when there are more optional effects, more optional ray tracing effects in games that the RTX 3080 could take advantage of. The more ray tracing, the higher settings, the higher the resolution, the RTX 3080 then pulls further away from that RTX 2080 Ti. So what will that mean for a game like Cyberpunk? I wonder, where it will have a lot of ray tracing features on top of AAA detail and effects work. Hard to know of course, but there has been a ray tracing benchmark released which gives us hints, I think, at that more distant ray traced future. As a part of the RTX 3080 release, Surgical Scalpels, as they're known, released the Boundary Benchmark, which uses Unreal Engine 4 and a heck of a lot of ray tracing effects, high quality models and textures, and generally excellent camera work to thrash the GPU. Just at a cursory glance here, I can see reflections, global illumination, and ray traced transparency effects and more. It looks really excellent. Incredible, in fact, and it also runs in an inverse relationship to how amazing it looks. The RTX 2080 Ti at 4K DLSS in performance mode here, so 1080p internally, in this opening sequence of the benchmark starts off at 30 FPS, but then very quickly stays in the middle to low 20s as this opening sequence continues on. The RTX 3080 at the same time runs 40% faster, and manages to stay primarily above 30 FPS, only with small blips below. So a higher than average win for the RTX 3080. When I watch this amazing demo benchmark here, running at 1080p internally and performing like this, I do wonder how certain future titles will target their performance with ray tracing on PC in light of these new RTX 3000 series cards. The RTX 2080 Ti can obviously not handle this combination of RTFX here at this resolution, but the RTX 3080 makes a fine showing as I see it. So I wonder if future games like this benchmark here will have more tiers of ray tracing effects so that Ampere cards can try their luck at them with DLSS resolutions. I don't know really, of course, but I really like what I'm seeing here, and it does make me curious how a game like Cyberpunk will run given its dearth of announced ray tracing effects. Anyway, that is enough for me for now. I hope you'd enjoy me moseying back through time to revisit my favorite titles with ray tracing here on a new GPU, and if you did, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about this video, write a comment below and follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Featuring its new Warp wireless technology, Omen's PC peripherals allow for lag-free gaming. From the 360-degree audio of its Omen frequency headphones, the 180-hour battery life of the Vector mouse, and the 2.4 GHz connection of its Spacer keyboard, Omen has you covered for the ultimate wireless experience.